Good morning. My name is Poul Østergaard, and I'm a professor of energy planning at Alberg University, where I do research and teaching on energy systems, energy system simulations, scenario making, and the like. First of all, I'd like to thank you for providing me this opportunity to share some thoughts on energy planning and the transition towards renewable energy systems with you. I've made a very detailed agenda where I'm basically looking into some of the history behind our energy consumption, looking into our current situation, and lastly, what will be in the future, or maybe I should add, what might be in the future, because we can only plan so and so much, we can analyze so and so much, we can come with suggestions, but I will try to look into some of the solutions we have in the future situation. Starting with what was. In historical terms, or historical overviews, history often seems to start with the oil crisis of the 1970s, or in some cases they go all the way back to the Suez crisis of the 1950s. In my presentation, to put things in a wider perspective, I've chosen to include an even longer time perspective to probably demonstrate some of the significance of energy to human development. What is life? Well, I've looked it up. Characteristics include metabolism, reproduction, and other factors. Focusing on metabolism, or rather catabolism, in case any biologist may have wandered in here today, humans use about 170 kilojoules per kilogram of body mass per day. That is something like 2 watts per kilo. This is very dependent on the activity and temperature level, but in fact, it also applies to other family members, that is, other primates. Analysis of Neanderthals show that an estimated energy consumption of 320 watts distribute evenly on fuels and wood. That is what was required at that time. These guys, they would die from heat loss if they dressed as the ones shown in the photo, and basically they needed both the fuel wood, they needed dresses, not dresses, but dress. They needed something to keep them warm. And through firewood, they could lower their meat requirements significantly, thereby enabling a more sustainable living. Thus, the use of energy has been a prerequisite for living in a temperate or cooler climate, both now, but also way back in the human development. Energy used beyond our immediate dietary demand enable us to stay warm, do more work, and shape the world that we are living in. At first, energy use was primarily renewable and the technology was simple. Fire, beasts of burden for labor. Beast of burden, or maybe this is an ill-fated attempt of air cargo that we see in the photo. They are generally using renewable energy sources in the shape and form of biomass, but usage is still limited through the biological processes involved. Things really kicked off when we started exploiting fossil energy reservoirs for traction and for mechanical processes. We may say that energy is, or maybe has been, a prerequisite for human development. Today, the metabolic energy demand is about 1/20th of the fuel-based energy demand of an average man, and humankind has gone from a simple metabolic life form to a life form operating through a large external energy, so-called exometabolism. This is a term I coined a few years ago while preparing for another lecture, but unfortunately I later Googled the term and discovered that a Russian did the same in 2007, so I can't take the entire honor for this term. Looking at a more recent development, we can observe some of the trends that is depicted on the graphs here. It does not show the full time range that I would have liked to show, but it does show an increasing trend in population, GDP, energy usage, and CO2 emission. Note that GDP is increasing at a higher rate than primary energy supply, but we do not have a decoupling. Some countries are working on that, and some countries have managed, but usually through the outsourcing of energy-intensive activities to other countries. The noble art of energy data archaeology furthermore reveals that the level in 1970 was approximately 8 times the demand in the year 1900. Moving up towards what what do we have today? Let's take the opportunity to focus on the world today, and maybe with a focus on Denmark, but I will also look outside of Denmark. First of all, here we see the relative performance of a number of selected countries in terms of primary energy supply, as well as in terms of gross domestic product, that is the economy of the countries. We can observe how the different countries are doing. We can see a link between economic development measured in GDP and primary energy supply. There are some outliers. We have, for instance, South Africa, with a relatively high energy demand per capita, but with a modest economy, and at the other range, we have Switzerland with a high economic output at a lesser energy consumption. So we have large discrepancies, and you can see that Switzerland and South Africa, they are actually at relatively comparable levels here. If we look at Denmark, we can see here a case of how the energy demand has evolved over the last decades, and it has been evolving or lying around the 800 petajoules per year. And I might mention that the economy has actually grown during the same period of time. The stable primary energy supply, and that's a result of various trends. We have some trends that are actually causing for a higher demand and some trends causing for a lower demand. Increasing prosperity, increasing energy efficiency, changes in residential patterns, changes in production sectors, what is being produced in Denmark, what is being produced outside of Denmark. They are all factors that are influencing the shape of this curve. We are also in Denmark, a country which until recently was the only EU member country that was self-sufficient with energy. And for approximately 25 years, Denmark was self-sufficient with oil, and for a smaller period also in energy sources in general. Renewable energy sources, as we see on the green line at the bottom, has increased. And today, this graph does not go all the way up to today, but today we have about 300 terajoules or petajoules, out of approximately 800 petajoules of renewable energy sources. Anyone who has ever done a presentation on the Danish energy system has shown a map like this, but it's a very good map and it very well encapsulates some of the changes that we've had in the Danish energy system. So looking at the situation in 1984-85, we have a limited number of CHP plants, a limited number of large-scale CHP plants, and some wind turbines scattered over the country. One of the ambitions of Danish energy policy at that time was to move electricity production towards areas where you have a heat demand, so you could basically use the waste heat from heat production. And that is why we see a very large increase in the number of local CHP plants across the country, and actually a decrease in some of the larger plants. Some have actually closed down. Wind turbines have also increased during the same period of time, and we have some offshore farms. We see some green dots in the blue water, and we are still focusing on expanding with offshore. This has, of course, been a tremendous increase in the complexity of the Danish energy system, and a complexity which is probably unrivaled or unparalleled throughout the world. And that means that we are experiencing very high degrees of renewable energy sources in our electricity system, and we're also experiencing some problems in trying to integrate this. Looking here at how wind has developed in western part of Denmark, we have the blue line that is indicating what is the share, simply taking into account how much is actually being produced. So we're not looking into curtailment or anything like that, but how much is actually being produced. And we can see that already in 2014, we passed something like 50% of the entire electricity demand being covered by wind turbines. And for the last few years, it has been changing up and down a little bit between 50 and 55%. The other curve, the red-green curve, that shows how many hours per year we have a production that actually exceeds the demand in this area. And we see that for the last few years, we have between 1,200 and 1,400 hours out of the 8,760 hours per year, where we actually have more than 100% wind power in the electricity system in Western Denmark. So we might say that this is a giant experimentarium where we can analyze what are the possibilities for handling such situations. Just to demonstrate what a week can look like in Denmark, this is a week in, again, western part of Denmark. Denmark is split up into two different synchronous areas, so this is based on data for Western Denmark, where we have wind power at the bottom, shown in the green color. We have the small-scale CHP plants, are here indicated as local CHP plants with blue. We have the large-scale central power stations in yellow, and we have the red line and the red area. The red line, that is the electricity demand, and the red area, that is electricity demand that is not directly met by domestic production. We see that wind power is actually changing a lot. We have some cases here actually. In this week, we had 2 different hurricanes coming. We had another one that was actually at more or less the same level. It was not diagnosed or characterized as a hurricane, but in terms of wind production, we were at the same level as the 2 hurricanes. During the actual hurricane, some wind turbines shut down. So if you have something that is nearing a hurricane, you will not necessarily have wind turbines cutting down or cutting off. So therefore, you can actually have production which is larger. What is interesting is that we also had some lows in the wind production. We had here on the Monday, and we even had a low between the 2 different hurricanes, 2 different weather patterns coming in. So we need to have a system which is extremely robust to be able to handle both the short-term fluctuations as indicated by the red rectangular and simply these troughs that we have as indicated here during the Monday. I usually say that nowadays we name hurricanes, but maybe in the future we also have to name the times where we don't have any wind power, because that might very well be a larger issue. What might be, or rather, how are we going to develop from here, and what can be changed and what needs to be changed? I focused a lot on wind power in this discussion here on excess electricity, but it's difficult basing an energy system on something that is as flighty as wind power. So basically, what are the options? We have sources of that are fluctuating according to cloud coverage, solar inclination, wind speed, direction, temperature, and it's all things that are beyond human control. Solar collector is good at producing hot water, or warm water at least. It's nice for a shower, but not really optimal for running your TV set. So we need some sources that can produce electricity. The bar chart that I'm showing here gives a comparison of different energy sources and how much we can harvest per area of land use. So photosynthesis, that is about 30% efficient if we have the correct wavelength and if we are only actually counting the photons that actually interact with biomass. And in reality, we are maybe 1/10 of that. So biomass, that is an extremely inefficient way of harvesting energy from the sun. Solar cells, solar collectors, they are much more efficient at harvesting solar energy than biomass. So we have some issues there because biomass of the ones shown here is the only one where we actually have a chance to control, and we can produce whenever we want. We can produce electricity based on it, and we can do that according to our demands. But biomass is also an area where we have multiple competing needs for biomass. First of all, we have demand for food, direct human ingestion. We have a demand for fodder, that's animal ingestion, and that's also typically indirect human ingestion. Fiber, building material, wood, basically. Fertilizer. We're using a lot of fossils nowadays to produce fertilizers, but in the future situation, we need to have the fertilizer production based on probably biomass resources. There are other options also, but we also need to have humus in the soil. We need feedstock, chemical feedstock. Biomass plays a nice role in that on equal terms as with oil products as we're using today. Forests, well, we can't cut down all the forest for human consumption. We have some biodiversity issues, we have some habitat issues. Of course, forests also have value for human recreation, hedonic, bequest value, existence value. So we can't use all biomass resources simply for meeting our own demands. And then, of course, we also have a demand for fuel. So fuel is one of many different potential competing resource or demands for biomass. So we have a small biomass availability, of which only a fraction is available for the energy system. In an energy plan we made for Aalborg a few years ago, we ended up distributing this biomass resource for heavy transportation, about one third for heavy industry, and 1/3 for thermal power generation. So even in the energy system, we have some strong demands for this. We have some other sources, but they are characterized by large fluctuations in their power availability, thereby potentially large imbalances. At the same time, due to the constraints in, for instance, biomass, we're also looking into a heavy electrification of the energy system, even though it will, to a high degree, be based on sources which are beyond our immediate control. And of course, electrification, that also usually means high losses. This is from a simple coal-based system where you have some losses in the transportation of coal halfway around the planet, then you're converting it to electricity. You have some conversion losses and you have some grid losses, and this is an old-fashioned incandescent light bulb. So we have some high heat losses there also. So electricity, yes, it's very convenient. Yes, it's something we can use in different contexts, but it is also characterized as something with high losses. It's a high quality resource, so we should use it wisely. So looking into electrification of the energy system in the heating sector, well, you could of course have direct electric heating, but that's somewhat inefficient, but heat pumps are a feasible solution. Of course, energy savings is and should be the first step on the ladder. Transportation, electricity where possible, otherwise some kind of power to X where we're using synthetic fuels based on electricity. Industry, the same deal, electricity where possible, or power to X if we really need a fuel. And other areas, electricity to the extent possible, or might as well add again, potentially power to X. We have some issues though. If we are looking back at this graph I showed before already, we still have some issues, and with more wind, with more PV, this issue is not going away. But we might also be looking into some of the solutions. One more thing that I'd like to introduce here, that is simply the market that we're currently using to run our electricity system. If I add a curve of the spot market price for the same week here, we can see that there's a tendency that if you have a low wind production, then you have a high electricity price. If you have a high wind production, then you have a lower electricity price. We also see that in the weekend, the last 2 days on the chart here, we have generally lower electricity prices, also because we have lower demands. So we have some issues there in the market. More general, we have an integration issue, matching demand and supply. We have some market issues, That also deals with the fact that who wants to invest in wind turbines, for instance, if wind turbines are causing market prices to drop, thereby undermining their own economic feasibility. We have some investment issues. We have other barriers, but I will not focus on them at this point, but I will dig a little bit deeper into the integration issues, the market issues, and the investment issues. If I look a little bit further into the market issues, I showed it for a week, but we do have the same case when we're looking at it over a year. This is not really a mathematically correct regression analysis, but there is a clear tendency that the higher the wind production, the lower the electricity cost, and vice versa. Showing it as a duration curve, we have stable level just above 200 kroners or 27 euros per megawatt hour, with some very highs and very high highs and some very low low. The question is, cheap electricity, is that a good or a bad thing? Well, there's not a conclusive answer to that. We have some integration technologies. They should primarily run under windy conditions. But if prices are too low for too much of the time, then they will actually run too much. And that could, for instance, be things like heat pumps for individual heating, heat pumps for district heating. They might be so efficient that they will run too much irrespective of electricity prices. So prices are actually too low for them to function with any kind of flexibility. Maybe we should have adaptive prices or adaptive taxes. Adaptive meaning, for instance, time varying or wind dependent taxes. We have some of the backup technologies, existing thermal plants, or in the future, maybe something more advanced than what we have today, something fuel cell based. They might be getting too few operating hours for economic feasibility. Presently, small-scale CHP units in Denmark, for instance, they close down actually and convert to biomass boilers if they're given the opportunity, because it simply does not pay to have the electricity production on CHP units. On the other hand, we might also run into situations where too many seek low-cost electricity for transportation and heating purposes, in which case cost may settle at a higher level. Lastly, we might mention that the current market construction requires sellers to be able to forecast their production with a certain level of accuracy. So we need an energy market or an electricity market where wind and PV does not lower the price, or at least not too much, where bidding is not necessarily short-term marginal cost-based. If everybody is bidding at zero, then you might very well end up at a price of zero, where demand stabilizes prices, where thermal facilities can afford to operate and not to operate. Otherwise, you'll have a problem with the backup facilities. We need flexible technologies to supply the required flexibility, and not, as in my case, there with heat pumps, operate as baseload simply because they're very efficient. They need to operate with a high degree of flexibility, and also to accommodate some of the renewable energy technologies. We need to have an electricity market where forecasting demands are a little bit more limited than they are today, where, for instance, in the Danish spot market, you have to be able to predict to the best extent possible your production within the next 12 to 36 hours. Looking into investments, we're going to a situation where we are going from costs which are very much based on running costs in terms of fuels. This is what we see here in the reference bar on this energy scenario that we made for Alberg a few years ago. There's a lot of fuel costs in the middle, and going towards a cost structure where the main cost structure lies in investments. I'll not very much stress the difference in the total cost of the two systems, but I think it's important to realize that we are going from a system with a high investment cost, or we are going towards a system with a high investment cost, but with low running costs. So how do we get there? We have an issue, and that is stability. So right now, for instance, we have extremely low oil prices. We've had very low oil prices during the Corona crisis, and that does not really provide stability. So if you, for instance, are in a situation where you are buying oil at market prices and you're considering switching to something else, then if oil prices are very low, then of course you do not have much of this incentive. We can also see in different countries where the sale of poor mileage cars has increased when oil prices are decreasing. So it's not an optimal situation. Looking at the cost of the oil over the last 30 years, we can see that prices have, in fact, fluctuated wildly. And this does not actually show up to and including the Corona crisis. This only goes up to 1919. But during the Corona crisis, we've had even lower prices, and I've even heard cases of negative prices on the oil market. So when you're a potential investor, what you want is a certain profitability or a certain threshold, and you want a certainty of future profitability. And with prices going up and down like this, you have an issue. Maybe we should have some floor prices for fossil fuels so they never decrease below a certain level. Looking at the Danish situation, we actually had some similar issues in the past. For instance, with CHP plants, they were planned under an assumption of increasing electricity prices and relatively stable fuel. That means, in this case, natural gas prices. But what happened was exactly the opposite. Electricity prices, they fell, natural gas prices increased, thereby eroding the economic feasibility of these plants. So we need financial certainty, we need motivation for public investments, also things like a low discount rate for assessing the feasibility of whether a given investment is positive or not, floor prices for fossil fuels, and also this market adaptation that I touched upon before, so that you do not end up in a situation where you have a lot of PV, wind turbine, wave power, whatever producers basically depressing the prices in the electricity market. So, looking at some of the options for integrating renewable electricity. Of course, it's a matter of matching supply and demand throughout the year. In case you're not familiar with it, the 50 Hertz indicated here on the photo, that indicates that we have a system in balance. So any deviations from 50 Hertz, that shows imbalances in the system. For an article I wrote a few years ago, I analyzed what was the implication and what would the implications be for the energy system if combining the Danish wind stock with similar wind stocks displaced a varying distance, and thus with wind power changing temporarily according to the distance. We were assuming that we would have an evening out of some of the fluctuation caused by different weather patterns coming over the country. Wind always changes in Denmark, I may add. When I did the analysis, maybe I was a little bit too conventional and still believing the conventional wisdom that interconnections work. So I stressed the discernible but small improvement rather than sounding the alarm and yelling it doesn't work, because it did in fact only change very slightly, interconnecting across a large geographical area. Another solution, potential solution, is trading. Well, trading is relevant if there are differences. Trading should be among unequals, like we have it here. So trading is not necessarily the answer to everything. There are limitations to this approach. To the extent that we can find trading partners with energy systems different from ours, then it can work, and it often does today. But again, for instance, taking the Danish case, our large neighbor to the south, Germany, they have a system developing in the same direction as the Danish energy system. That means a lot of PV, a lot of solar power. So we are basically trying to sell the same goods at the same time as Germany does. We have a northern neighbor, Norway. They have a hydro system, which is of course a lot better. But of course, Norway is a relatively small country, and even though they have good hydro resources, it is not sufficient to function as a battery for the entire European system. We have flexible electricity demand as a potential solution. If we take some numbers and putting it into perspective, a typical Danish house or dwelling or family, they use some 3,000 to 5,000 kilowatt hours per year for the ordinary electricity demand. This is assuming there's no electric heating or cooling for that matter, which is not much of an issue here anyway. So if we took a house, the same house, and gave it electric heating through heat pumps, then we would have an additional electricity demand of some 6,000 kilowatt hours per year. That's for heating and domestic hot water. And this, of course, would have a much higher proportion of the demand in the wintertime than in the summertime. And lastly, we can look at electric vehicles. If we take a car that corresponds to filling up the tank 50 liters once per month, that translates to something like 2-3 megawatt hours per year. So we have some flexibilities. And if we start by looking at the house, there we have a limited flexibility in load shifting in the ordinary electricity load. Basically, you can postpone doing the laundry as much as you care. It will not impact the energy system as such. But as soon as we start integrating some of the other sectors, the heating sector and transportation sectors, then prospects are looking much better. This is what brings us to the smart energy system that you have on the right, where you actually have connections between the transportation sector, the industry, the electricity system, cooling system, and everything basically. So everything is connected. You're using storage throughout the system to ensure that you have the correct flexibility. You have units which are operating with flexibility in the conversion systems. You might have some designated storages in the heating system, which are a lot cheaper than designated storages in the electricity systems. So we have some options once we see the entire energy system as a combined whole. We could also say that trading becomes relevant once selling and buying becomes a conscious decision rather than a natural consequence of the weather. Basically, if the wind is blowing in one country, it's probably also blowing in the neighboring country. But if you have some changes in the system so that you can actually dispatch your electricity not according to the weather, then you have a better possibility of actually having a well-functioning electricity market. So to summarize some of the things that I've been presenting here, we're looking into a heavily electrified electricity system based on an even higher extent on fluctuating power production, and that has some inherent issues. We cannot necessarily rely on trading with our neighbors to solve the issue of balancing the electricity system, particularly not when factoring in similar developments in different places. Geographical difference do not offer sufficient variability or flexibility, and we need to activate all the flexibility, all the storage capabilities or abilities of the entire energy system, factoring in heating, transportation, cooling, industry, whatever, to be able to provide as much flexibility as possible in the energy system. thank you very much. This is what I had planned to say something about today, and I will be happy to hear some questions when we come to the online version of this. Thank you very much.